Okay, a couple things. My name's Joe Frazier. I'm currently serving as the chairman of our Camas Valley History Group. I'm going to introduce our presenters today. If any of you read the Park Record article about this, I have to set the record straight that I did not do all the research and I am not presenting today. That came across as I was doing a lot and I'm not. So I need to give credit where credit is due. So first of all, our mobile museum, which is in the travel trailer, is outside. It will be available after the talk today. And it will showcase some of the women we presented last year. So if you missed last year's presentation, first of all, you can find it on our website, but also there's information about the women out in the museum. So our presenters today, we've got four strong women ourselves to present to you. They will be lifting weights after to show you how strong they are. No. So we will have Pat Darcy. A lot of you know Pat Darcy. She's the daughter of Helen Herritt and Pete Besant, and she's going to be talking about her mother. Donna Yorplume is our next, well, this isn't in order, our next presenter. She's a lifelong resident of Camas Valley, and I think I counted fifth generation, some fifth or sixth. Kate Wynn will be presenting. She's our group secretary and one of our writers and researchers. She is a first generation Alex resident. And our last presenter is Deb Lambert. She's been here a lot of years.
32.
32. I didn't think she was over 32 years old, so I wasn't gonna say. But she not only is one of our great researchers as well, she is our PowerPoint magician. So all of the fun stuff on the screen is her doing. Unless there's a mistake, she said.
And then it's Kate's fault.
So without any further talk from me, Kate, you're first. All right. Oh, let me turn the lights on. That's not the lights. Yes.
Sorry. We have done this before, I promise. Okay. Our first strong woman demonstrates the challenges. There we go. Mike.
Okay. I'll get her.
Okay. Thank you. Our first strong woman demonstrates the challenges of researching the history of women from the pioneer era. In an article published in the Journal of the American Historical Association called Presentations on History, Gerda Lerner wrote, "Women's history remains challenging for the researcher. The vast and varied local efforts by which women built the infrastructure of communities form story as yet incompletely documented and incoherently told." When I start to research a pioneer, my first stop is always Family Search. Hundreds, if not thousands, of amazing family historians kindly share their research on this invaluable resource, and many of the images and stories that we share are found there. If you're one of those people, thank you very much. But I can only use what's there, and sometimes that's not enough. In this case, there is a history of Fanny Jane and Henry Beisel, written by their granddaughters. It's fascinating, but it's sadly very brief. And Fanny Jane is mentioned independently of her male relatives just 3 times: her baptism, her work at Sawmill, and her death. Her son David Alexander Beisel's autobiography fills in some details, but again, he only mentions his mother in connection with a male family member. Her granddaughter Della provides a little more information, mostly about Fanny Jane's movements after Henry's death, but not much else. So, with these caveats, here is Fanny Jane Beisel's history. Fanny Jane Leffler was born in 1850 in Ontario, Canada, the 8th of what would eventually be 10 surviving children of Ellen Marshall Thane and David Leffler. In 1855, the family moved to Genesco, Iowa, where the remaining children were born, before David died in 1865. At about the same time, the Beisel family moved to Genesco. Benjamin Franklin Beisel was from Pennsylvania and had moved steadily west with his wife and 7 surviving children. His oldest son, Henry, was 19 and soon became interested in 15-year-old Fanny Jane. They were married 2 years later. Their first 2 children were born in Iowa, but by 1872 they were on the move. Benjamin Franklin, their 3rd child and first son, was born in Missouri, and the next 3 in Salt Lake City. Interestingly, neither Fanny Jane nor Henry were baptized into the LDS Church until after they arrived in Salt Lake City. Henry Beisel was baptized in 1876 and Fanny Jane in 1877. David Alexander Beisel, their youngest son, remembered, "I was born February 4th, 1878 in Salt Lake City, Utah, 9th East and 7th South. Our house was 1 block north of my uncle John Leffler's grist mill." John Marshall Leffler was not the only family member in Utah at this point. Fanny Jane's mother, grandmother, and sister, as well as her uncle, John Johnson Thane, and other members of the Thane family were already in Utah. David wrote, "We lived in Sugar House until I was about 3½ years old. Then we moved out to what was called Rhodes Valley, now known as Camas Valley, Summit County. Woodland was already settled, and in fact, John Johnson Thane and his family, and at least 3 of Fanny Jane's siblings were all there, as well as Mary Ann Thane Moon, one the subject of last year's talk, who arrived in 1881 with her husband, Henry Moon, who was to become the first bishop. The family were unsettled at first. David wrote, "We moved into a small cabin east of the Fitzgerald Ranch. My father built a 1-room cabin. There was no work available, so we moved into Riley's Canyon." 2 moves later, he wrote, "Then we moved to the old watermill owned by John Moon. My father was the sawyer at this mill. We lived there until I was 14 years old. My mother," here we go, finally, "my mother cooked for the men in the summer, and I ran errands for her and carried wood for the cook stove." In the summer of 1891, Henry began building a house. The family moved from the mill in February 1892. In December 1896, Henry was set apart by Francis Marion Lyman to the Northern States Mission. The older children had all left home by this point, and so David worked to support himself and his mother. Henry was honorably released on December 15th, 1898. Sometime after returning from his mission, Henry Beisel bought the Woodland Cash Store, which he and Fanny Jane ran until his death in 1924. David took over the store at his father's death. Fanny Jane moved in with David's family for a while, and then moved up to Apalco with her daughter Mary Etty Moon. She died at the home of another daughter, Fanny Jane Beisel Murphy, in Midview, Duchesne, in 1931. She and Henry are both buried in Woodland. Our next strong woman's life is better documented. Minnie Laura Butters was born in Farmington in 1877, the 6th child, 3rd surviving, and 2nd daughter of Emma Sarah Jones and James Butters. James and Emma were from England and had come to England in 1869 on the Manhattan with James's parents and their young son, Henry Heber. They travelled to Utah by train in 1870 and made their home in Farmington before moving to Woodland in around 1883. They made the 3-day move in a wagon with a cow tied alongside. Although only small, Minnie remembers the cougar that stalked the wagon as they crossed the Provo River bottoms to Bench Creek. James built a small log cabin for his family, then 5 children, and cleared 40 acres of land. Minnie went to school in a 1-room cabin. Her parents and those of all the other students paid the teacher with board and lodging and a little cash. Minnie also worked as janitor at the school for 50 cents a week. When she was 13, she began cooking for the workers at the mill and housekeeping for neighbours on Bench Creek. She earned $3.50 to $4 per week. Also, when she was 13, Minnie made a wedding dress, although it's not recorded who for. Speaking of weddings, when Minnie was 18, a sheep man came from Draper named Riley Fitzgerald. He came to the Butters home to ask if he could leave some of his supplies with them while he was off with his sheep. In payment, he gave the family mutton from his herd. And Minnie hid his hat so that he would stay a little longer. While they were courting, a neighbour of the Butters told Minnie that if she could find him a buyer for his ranch, he would buy her a dress. When Riley proposed, she persuaded him to buy the Potts Ranch, and Mr. Potts bought her the promised $50 dress. Minnie and Riley were married in 1896. They moved into George Potts's two-room house, where 6 of their children were born. In 1902, Riley bought the property on the woodland bench across from their existing land. There he built a 2-story home. 6 more children were born there. In total, the Fitzgeralds had 12 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. Minnie was a skilled organizer. Her daughter, Larry Ann, wrote, "There wasn't a thing she couldn't do. Besides cleaning the house, she made our clothes, sold our shoes," that's sold as in sold, "cut our hair, milked the cows, made butter, sauerkraut, gardened, and everything else that had to be done around the house. She also made all of the laundry soap and did all the laundry in a copper boiler on top of the stove. The children took turns operating the hand-agitated washing machine." In 1919, the family moved to Marion when Riley bought the Louis Smith Ranch. Minnie got up at 3 a.m. to make eggnog for the boys to tide them over until they got back after milking. She also cooked meals for those visitors who came to the ranch in search of Louis Smith's supposed cache of gold. Riley died in 1946, and Minnie and their daughter Emma, who never truly recovered from a bout of encephalitis, moved to a house in Camas. After Emma died in 1957, Minnie's health worsened, and she went to live with Guy and Laurie Ann. She died in 1958 and is buried with Riley in Marion. And I'm going to now hand over to Deb. Oh.
Can everyone hear me? Is this okay? So, I may get fired for this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Stop firing me. Oops. That says strong like mom. Real quick, 7 years ago, on first day of spring, my mother passed away. She lived here in Camas for 22 years, which was the longest she'd ever lived in one place in her life. She basically raised my son, and she is the strongest woman I know. We're not going to talk about her except for that. But Kate and all of us that are presenting today came from very strong mothers, and that's why I believe this is so important to us. And I almost wore this instead of my other shirt. Yeah. All right. Anna Catherine Worley was born in 1830 in, someplace in Switzerland. Her parents were Johannes Worley and Margareta Elizabeth Neuber. In all her parents had 11 children, but only 4 survived to adulthood. Anna Catherine was the youngest. And that's an idea. I can stand right here. What are we doing? Oh. In 1835, when Anna was 5, her mother died, followed by her father 5 years later in 1842. After his death, she was placed in an orphanage where she learned the art of lace making and embroidery. This intricate work was done by hand in poor light, and her eyes started to suffer from these conditions. 15, she left the orphanage to live with a friend who was very concerned about her eyesight. One day, while sitting alone in her darkened room, she heard singing somewhere in the house. She realized it was the Mormon missionaries visiting her friend's family and became curious about what they had to say. George Mayer, one of the first missionaries to Switzerland, wrote in his mission journal on June 7th, 1854, Catherine Worley was afflicted with sore eyes, and the doctor said she would go blind. She came to hear me preach several times. She desired baptism. She is now restored to her sight and gave her testimony that she was healed through the power of God's truth and the ministration of laying on of hands of Elder Mayer. George Mayer's mission didn't end with the baptism of Swiss converts. Over the course of 6 months, he led them nearly 900 miles to get to a ship in Liverpool, England. It was an ordeal that involved every form of transportation of the time. On January 25th, 1855, they traveled by carriage as far as the River Rhine. It was frozen, so they waited a month before crossing on February 15th. After which they took a train to Stuttgart, Germany. On March 12th, they got to Rotterdam, Netherlands. From there, they took a steamer to Hull on the east coast of England. On March 31st, they reached Liverpool. They boarded the Juventa. There were 570 Swiss Latter-day Saints led by President Franklin D. Richards. Mayer recorded in his journal, "We had continuous wind and there was a considerable seasickness. We all landed safe in Philadelphia on the 4th of May, 1855, a passage of 35 days without a death on the ship." From Philadelphia, the group boarded a freight train for Pittsburgh. En route, the train ran against the passenger cars and mashed 2 cars. But the hand of the Lord was with us, for there was not a saint hurt. So apparently a freight train hit a passenger train and nobody was hurt, except for one guy that mashed his leg. They traveled by steamship to St. Louis, Missouri, and on to Atkinson a week later. Once they got their wagons, they moved 5 miles out to camp at Mormon Grove. Mayer wrote, "The cholera came in the camp and 22 died in 5 days." Anna Catherine and the rest of the group joined the Richard Ballantyne Company. They reached Salt Lake City on September 24th. George Mayer recorded thus, "The brass band of music came to accompany us to the city. The next morning we crossed the little mountain and drove into the city with flags flying. My flag was the beehive on one side and the motto, 'The bees are coming home,' on the other, and a spread eagle with truth and liberty." John and Anna. Did we talk about her marrying John? She married John Sincere Carpenter. I think that's one of the. We work really well together. Anyway, she married John Sincere Carpenter, which I'm sure many of you are here are related to. John and Anna started married life in Mill Creek, where their first son, John Worley, was born in January 1857. In March 1858, the Saints were instructed to move south to Utah County in response to the approach of Johnston's army to put down the perceived yet false Mormon rebellion against the Union. It's now called the Utah War. The Carpenters settled in Spanish Fork, where they had their second son, Louis Martin, on January 1859. With the threat of Johnston's army over, the Carpenters moved back to Mill Creek, where 2 more children were born, Margaret Catherine in February 1861 and Selena in February 1864. In 1865, the little family moved to Camas Valley, and the last 4 children were born, Aaron Grant and Julian Moses were born in Peoria in 1867 and 1870, and Eleanor Maria and William Franklin in Camas in 1872 and 1874. John Sincere made his living as a laborer and shoemaker, charging from 10 cents to $1.75 to repair shoes for the residents of Camas Valley. Who here is related to the Carpenters in any form? Just one? I thought half the valley was related to that. All right. Anna Catherine's granddaughter wrote that the family suffered many hardships and privations of early pioneer life. Often small potatoes and gravy were often all they had to feed their growing children for each meal in a day. John Sincere died in November 1894, leaving Anna Catherine a widow at the age of 65. Her history recounts that she loved to have her grandchildren with her during the short Camas summers. Anna had a flower garden with a mass of colors. She had bleeding hearts near her front gate, as well as a neat vegetable garden. Anna Catherine Worley Carpenter was remembered as a quiet, uncomplaining lady and a faithful worker in the Sunday School and Relief Society. She became ill on November 15th, 1912, and died 23rd of January, 1913, at the age of 82 after suffering greatly for 10 weeks. She is buried in Camas. For whatever reason, they give me the controversial women. So here we go. Mary Elizabeth Gines, born in Florence, Nebraska in March 1859, the youngest child of Anne West and George Gines of Warwick, England. The family joined the Latter-day Saint Church in 1847, and in about 1851, most of the family sailed to America, settling in Illinois and then Nebraska. They crossed the plains in about 1862. Sorry, I've got to get a drink of water. George and Anne and their three youngest children, Samuel, Emmeline, and Mary, came to Camas Valley in 1864. They lived first in Peoria before George bought 160 acres outside the Rhodes Valley Fort. And it is believed it is the property along 2nd South and Main Street. We don't have any details of their early years, but all three married locals, and many of these descendants still live in the valley today. Any relation to the Gineses? Okay. While living with their parents in Peoria, Mary met William James or Bill Pace. They were married in the Endowment House in Salt Lake City in 1880. For the next 28 years, Mary's life would be filled with tragedy and loss and be marked with a sensational event that she endured with grace. Now, before Mary, Bill Pace was born in Provo, 1854. He came from a prominent family, not only in Utah, but also in American history. His ancestors came to America in 1611. In the eyes of many, this pedigree could be considered American historical royalty. Unfortunately for Mary Elizabeth and several others, he was no prince. In 1873, Bill had married Victoria Adelaide Hoggart, and the couple had 2 sons. Her history states, her husband proved to be a non-educated lazy boy whose only ambition was to have Vic read novels to him. 3 years later, on the advice of her church leaders, she divorced him. Now, we did do a presentation on Bill during our Rascals and Renegades presentation last year. But I need to recap just some of his highlights. To get a feel for the man that Mary married, here's a quick glimpse into his shenanigans, many occupations, and frequent litigations. For the first 10 years of marriage, marriage, Bill tried his hand at farming. In 1890, he sued South Camas Irrigation Company. In the 1890s, he opened a sawmill in Camas Valley, and in April 1893, the loggers who provided lumber for the mill sued him for low wages. Edwin Kimball was a wealthy businessman and mayor of Park City. When he died, Bill owed him nearly $7,000. That would be over $200,000 today. Edwin's wife, Geneva, sued him for the money. There are no details in the case of the Park City Bank suing him on the same year. In 1896, Bill sued his neighbor, Parley Neely, for $40.90 for merchandise sold and delivered. Neely demanded a jury trial, and Bill demanded Neely be required to defray the cost of the jury. Justice Van Tassel, yes, related to our Van Tassels, ordered Pace to pay the costs, which Bill refused to do. So the justice refused to proceed with the case, whereupon Bill then sued the justice. You like to sue people? While her husband's shenanigans continually made the news, Mary spent her life trying to keep things together at home. Her first child, a boy named William Byron, was born February 1882. Over the next 21 years, Mary had 12 more children, averaging about 8 months between each child. On July 24th, 1908, an event occurred that was life-changing for the family. Mary and all of her children went to Camas for the Pioneer Day celebration. With them went William Byron, her oldest son. He was now 26 and married with 2 young sons of his own. Bill preferred to stay home and drink. When the family returned home, a dispute ensued over whether to milk the cows or put them to pasture. Bill tried to choke Mary, and she called on William Byron for help, the oldest son. Her son decided to load all their effects into a wagon and take their mother and leave the ranch. Bill came into the yard and drew a gun on William Bryan. William Bryan grabbed a rifle from the wagon, shot and killed his father. It was quickly established that Bill Pace was dangerous under the influence. Mary testified at her son's trial, and Bill had mistreated her family for 23 years, once picking up one of the young children by the feet while he was drunk and beating their head against the side of the house until stopped by a neighbor. Her 15-year-old son, Frank, no longer lived at home because of his father's cruelty. Since this is National Women's Month, we wanted to talk just one little second. I had a lot more in here. Kate took it out, but on domestic violence. Today it would be called domestic violence. In the early 1900s, it was considered, well, unfortunate. Domestic abuse has been around since the beginning of history. In ancient Rome, it was considered normal to beat your wife. From this tradition, we get the early version of the rule of thumb, which permits that a husband can beat his wife with a rod or switch, as long as it is no greater than the girth of his right thumb. Yet, it is within my lifetime that laws protecting children and domestic partners started to exist. In 1992, Dr. Antonio Navallo, America's first female Surgeon General, described domestic violence as a cancer that gnaws at the body and soul of American family. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence estimates that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men are victims of domestic abuse. 15.5 million children are exposed annually to in the US to domestic abuse. I think it's relevant. It happened back in the day. It was treated much differently, and it's still evolving as in terms of help. Mary was 49 when Bill died. She still had 6 children living at home. She needed to support herself and young families, so she took in washing. Her history says that she nursed the sick and took care of babies, but it's not clear whether the last 2 activities provided income or if she did it as part of the duties as a counselor in the Relief Society, an organization she served in for years. She died on March 10th, 1940, and is buried in Woodland. Rachel Maholda, or they called her Hulda, Lockhart Miles, was born in 1836 in Monroe, Mississippi Territory, as it was then called. Her parents were Margaret Maria Towery and John Lockhart Jr. She was the oldest of 5 children. Her mother, Margaret Maria, was from a slave-holding family, but she met John Lockhart, who had moved from South Carolina with just $100 and a saddle horse after a quarrel with his family over his father's will. After they married in 1834, Margaret's father gave them an extensive piece of land nearby, but in time, John moved the family to Monroe County, Mississippi, where Margaret had family. In 1844, Latter-day Saint missionaries came to Mississippi, and the Lockharts were baptized after Margaret's adoptive daughter was healed by laying on of hands. Margaret's family harassed them after they joined the new faith, trampling crops and destroying fences. And in 1848, they sold their land and cattle and moved to winter quarters. They crossed the plains in the Heber C. Kimball Company, arriving in Salt Lake City in October of 1848, in the same company as the Miles family. Maria Vietz and Albert Miles and their 4 children. The Miles family were early converts to the LDS Church and moved to Nauvoo around 1843 to 44, where Albert worked as a carpenter on the temple and the Nauvoo house. Both families settled in Cottonwood. John Lockhart died in 1849 and is thought the 2 oldest boys, Benjamin Adrian and Edwin Ruthven, weird name, helped with the farm work on the Lockhart farm. Benjamin and Hulda were married in 1857 in Salt Lake City. In total, they had 13 children, of whom all except one lived into adulthood. They started their married life in Cottonwood, but in 1860 they were sent to settle Peoa. Benjamin's sister, Sally Ann Miles, and her husband, Orrin Strong Lee, were also among the early settlers. Then comes the controversy. On September 13th, 1875, Abraham Marchant, the newly called bishop of the Peoa ward, introduced Rachel Miles as the first Relief Society president. Other sources say the ward was organized in 9th of July, 1877. So there's a two-year discrepancy on when Peoa actually got started. As you can see, this was the makeup of the Relief Society presidency. There was President Hulda Miles, first counselor Lydia Marchant. Anyway, goes on and on and on. Oops, go back one. As you can see, Hulda was the only one not related to Abraham. Now keep in mind, Peoa was much smaller. There were only about a dozen people in the entire ward. So finding leadership was a challenge. So I guess he grabbed people that he knew the best. Anyway, there's little evidence from the minutes of the meeting kept during the first year and a half that Rachel Miles was not anything but invested in the cause. She was quoted as saying, "I desire to do what God requires of me. I pray God that he may inspire each and every one of us. I hope that we will all pray to God and be humbled." That was in April 5th, 1877. She urged the women to be punctual in their meetings, and she encouraged them to be unified. However, the good feeling between the bishop and the Relief Society president was not to last. Things started to turn south for President Miles when she began noticing Bishop Marchant at the society's meetings. The women met once a month for what they called a work meeting, quilting for the poor and whatever. That meeting he did not attend. But every second week, in between work meetings, the women also met for testimony meeting at the Peoa schoolhouse. Bishop Marchant often attended. He not only attended, but he usually took occasion to speak. As the presiding elder, Marchant felt entitled to attend the meetings of any ward organizations, which is still true today. Huldah, however, treasured the thought of women meeting together independent of the men. For her, this was a chance for women to do what they had never been. Oh, I'm taking that part out. She resented the bishop's frequent attendance and speeches. When she had seen enough, she told him so. That's a little bit controversial. But it wasn't just that President Miles didn't want the bishop at the society's meetings. They also had some kind of disagreement about what to do with the Relief Society grain. He had counseled her on how to act, but she did not take his counsel, he said. This had caused the visiting teachers to give incorrect instructions. From this point of view, that amounted to an act of insubordination. Quote, the teachers of the Relief Society have been insulted, he explained, which means I must interfere. He was keeping watch over his flock, and he had come to believe that Sister Miles was a danger to that flock. I'm taking a little sidetrack because I was wondering what the Relief Society was like back in the day. Quite different than it is today in some respects. So I'm using Francis as an example. This was in the minutes in 1915. So in terms of, what was the norm of the Relief Society raising money? It appears that the Relief Societies of that day were a force to be reckoned with, and it seems more independent and hardier than they are now. From the Mountain Memories book, the Relief Society sisters purchased one of the school buildings in 1950 and moved it near the church and cleaned it and used it as a meeting hall. They rented it out in 1916 for $5 a month. Later that year, they planted and harvested 138 bushels of potatoes and had on hand 2,408 pounds of wheat. They purchased a sewing machine and new chairs. Each member paid 15 cents per month until they were paid for. This was during the presidency of another strong woman, Sarah Elvira Pace Prescott, that we will get to soon. So back in the day, it was kind of hard labor for them. A side note, in 1877 was not only a bad and sad year for Rachel Miles, but also for the little town of Peoa. During the winter of 1877, an epidemic of diphtheria took the lives of many children and adults. Fear of catching the deadly disease was so strong that burials occurred immediately after death and funerals were not held. A section of the Peoa Cemetery is known as D Row because of the graves of diphtheria victims. Speaking of that, come to the Camas Valley Historic Ghost Tour of the Peoa Cemetery on September 28th. Come and learn more about the D Row and the other amazing things that happened and are buried in the Peoa Cemetery. I'm always given a pitch for stuff we do. So back to the presentation. In probably October of 1877, 1.5 years after Rachel was called as Relief Society president, Bishop Marchant called the sisters together and said this: I do not desire to wound the feelings of anyone present this afternoon. He said, we should be careful how we use our tongues. I have tried to learn to control myself. I know that I have my feelings We should speak wisdom of God so that in the future we will not wound the feelings of any person. On this day, though, he felt he owed it to them to explain why he had asked for Miles' resignation. He knew he might wound some of them. Among other things, he said, I told Sister Miles yesterday that I had no further use for her as a president of the Relief Society, and I say so now. Given a chance to answer in the meeting, Rachel Miles admitted to the women that she planned resigning anyway. She, quote, had her feelings hurt. If I had done wrong, I hope to be forgiven and wish the people to know the truth. Now, for those of you that might not know this handling it that way would not happen today. Would it? Would it, Sherry Kay? I don't think so. No? You weren't listening. Never mind. Benjamin Miles died in 1888. Huldah was a widow for 24 years, dying in 1912. They are buried in Peoria. My mouth is dry. Sarah Luella Winterton was born in 1910 in Charleston, Utah. She was the fifth of 10 children to Sarah Van Wagoner and Hiram Shurtleff Winterton. Hiram was a cattle rancher, and Luella grew up helping on the farm and exploring the countryside around Charleston, Walberg, and Strawberry Valley. In 1922, brought out his brother and John C. Whiting, and unable to find land in Wasatch, he bought a couple of ranches in Woodland. In 1928, the family moved to Bench Creek, which is Woodland. Luella switched schools from Wasatch High to South Summit High in Camas, which she loved. She wrote, "This was a happy time in my life. I had the opportunity to compete in the state tryouts with my saxophone. I had just started playing the saxophone that year and placed second in the state. This was a great thrill for me. I also got to play in the orchestra, the band, and sing in the glee club." At that time in Woodland, there was no electricity and no roads, just dirt tracks that were impassable except by horse and wagon if it was wet. The children traveled to school by buggy and did homework by candlelight. The first house they lived in Woodland burned down, so for a while they lived in the old White House, which had been run as a hotel by one of last year's strong women, Mary Ann Thane Moon White. But David Beisel wanted to buy the White House, and so Hiram bought David's house for him and the store that went with it. The place was in poor condition, Luella wrote. When we got there, things were in such a mess. There were bed bugs and mouse trails. We worked for days and basically did the whole thing over. The Wintertons tore out the old bulk storage bins to make way for modern shelving and tried to modernize the wiring added in the early 1920s. But the late summer of 1929, while the wiring was still in the transition state, a faulty connection caused the store to catch fire. Luella wrote, "When we had it about finished so we could get the fire insurance on it, a fire started and burned to the ground." That sounds like my luck. Luella managed to carry out the cash register with over $100 inside, and it sat by the side of the road until all the excitement was over. Everyone ran with buckets to the stream in front of the house, but water did little to help. Soon, even the house was lost. Thankfully, no one was harmed. 2 children were rescued from the burning house, but as Luella said, the fire burned everything we had and left us with nothing. With the financial backing of ZCMI, the Wintertons built a new brick store on a lot adjacent to the church. Hiram and Harold did most of the work on it with some professional help. They were able to open the beautiful new store furnished with shelving and carved display cases from an old ZCMI store. In the Christmas of 1920, in time for Christmas in 1929. For those of you that don't know, it's still there, the Woodland Cash Store. The family lived in the back of the store in a single room until a new home could be built the following summer. To begin with, Luella's mother and oldest brother, Harold, ran the store, with the younger children helping. But in April of 1931, Harold and his father were hit by a train on their way to a stock show. Hiram was injured, but Harold was killed. That October, Luella married Lamont Walker from Peoria. She wrote, "My mother was heartbroken because of the loss of Harold. I would come from Peoria after I was married and help mother while Mont hauled the mail to Park City. I would help my mother until about time for him to come home, and then I would go home and fix his supper. Finally, Sarah, the mother, told Luella, I can't do it any longer. Will you and Lamont take the store?" Mont gave his mail contract to his brother Glenn, and the young couple moved into the back of the store. This was the depths of the Depression. The Woodland Cash Store's customers rarely had the cash to pay for what they needed. Luella had a stock in the store had to stock the store on less than $500. To make ends meet, Mont went into the trucking business. He drove eggs to Draper and returned with chicken feed, and hauled coal, the only fuel available in Woodland, from Price, a more than 24-hour trip with a full load. To keep the gas station going, he hauled gasoline in 50-gallon drums chained to the back of his flatbed truck. As the Depression eased, the Woodland Cash Store went into a new modern household appliance business, selling Philco Bendix washing machines and dryers, Kelvinator refrigerators, and RCA and Dumont televisions, although in time, this became more of a trial than a boon. The distribution company had trained Vern Huff to do the repair work, but he moved out, and in 1949, Luella got a call from a distraught woman who said, "Luella, this washer you told me is flooding my kitchen." Luella wrote, "I serviced the washing machine and dryers for 20 years for free to help people out. People would say down at Flint's, 'This Mrs. Walker up there tells us the bearings on our washer have gone out.' And Mr. Flint would say, 'Well, she knows.'" And I think of now when I call when my washer's broke, it cost me $300 just for them to come out and look at it. What's that?
That's at 2 years old, not 20 years old.
Yeah, exactly. But it wasn't all work. Luella ran the church cannery and was always willing to play the saxophone or piano at parties. She and Mont raised 3 children and traveled to San Francisco and overland all the way to Florida. Sadly, Lamont died in 1971. After this, Luella began to close the store in the winter and spend time with her children. But there is one more story about the trials of being a shopkeeper. She says, I was at my store getting gasoline for one of my neighbors, and there was a car that had backed in. I thought maybe he is planning to rob me and has backed in to make a quick getaway. Then he followed me into the store. I said to him, "May I help you?" He started toward the back of the store and said, "You may if you have any money." I went over to the cash register and got $74.25 out of there. I could hardly get it out because my hands had arthritis in them. He said, hurry up, hurry up." I said, "You wouldn't hurt me." And I looked at him right in the face. He said, "That's what you think. You lay down on the floor and count to 100 very slowly, because in 10 minutes, if you get off the floor, I have a friend who will come along with a shotgun and finish you off. Oh, I knew that was a story. I knew he had no friend that would be along in 10 minutes, but I counted the 10 very slowly. I didn't even get down on that dirty floor. It was her floor. I called the telephone operator and told her I'd been robbed. She said, "You call Colville and I'll call Camas." She called Leon Wild, the sheriff from Camas, and I called Ron Robinson in Colville and gave them a description of the man. When he got to Wanship, there were 4 patrolmen waiting for him. He slid off the road and they brought him back in handcuffs. On the way back, he told them the whole story. He knew I was a widow and I had come out on a Sunday to plan, and he had come out on a Sunday to plan how he was going to rob me. He made a statement later that if he had to do it again, he would do it right the next time, whatever that means. Oops. Luella sold the store in 1987. She died 18 October 1992 and is buried with Lamont in Charleston. Who here knew Luella? Would have been a fun lady to know. I turn the time over now to Kate. Sorry, Donna.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So Luella was forced into being an entrepreneur, but made a go of it despite everything. Now we're going to hear about another accidental entrepreneur. Margaret Alice Warr Clark was born in Camas in 1885, the 8th child of Mary Ann Merritt and Joseph Hawley Warr. Mary Ann Merritt was born in a covered wagon near the Little Blue River in Nebraska en route to Utah, and narrowly survived drowning as an infant when the wagon turned over in a swift-moving river. Her parents were both converts from Jersey in the British Channel Islands who had married on board the Olympus. They were among the earliest settlers of Camas, then called Rhodes Valley. Joseph Hawley, Margaret Alice's father, was the oldest son of Eliza Sims and Justinian Warr. The family came from Somerset, England, and were also early settlers of Rhodes Valley. Joseph's brother, Alma, was the clerk in the co-op store within the Rhodes Valley fort and became known as Uncle Almy, the well-loved shopkeeper of Camas. Joseph was the man who was tasked with protecting the crops when the settlers moved into Fort Sage Bottom. After the end of the Indian Wars, Joseph and Mary built a home just outside Camas, where they raised 14 children, 12 of whom survived infancy. Julianne, Margaret Alice's oldest sister, remembered, "Our home was always the center for children to gather. The house was in a canyon, and there were 4 families there. This was about a quarter mile from Camas. We would have primary dances on the lawn." Mary Ann suffered ill health, including milk-leg, a kind of deep vein thrombosis associated with childbirth. And her oldest daughter, Julia Ann, mostly raised the children until she left home in 1900. That said, Mary Ann was very anxious for the children to go to school. Her mother had been a school teacher in Jersey, and she could read and write in French, though not in English. Margaret Alice and her siblings attended the schoolhouse, now relocated from the center of the Rhodes Valley Fort. Among the earliest teachers were Ruth Burbage and Adelia Lambert. There are no records of Margaret Alice's life as a young woman, but in 1904 she married Daniel Clark. He was born in 1878 in Scotland of Irish descent and came to Utah with his brothers sometime before 1900 to work in the Park City mines. Yeah, my papers are stuck. Sadly, they were not married long. Dan died in 1919, leaving Margaret Alice with 6 small children. At some point during this time, Margaret Alice trained as a registered nurse, although it's not known where she studied. What is known is that in 1919, she was working at the Miners' Hospital in Park City. As a mining town, Park City was in dire need of local medical care. Injured miners had to be transported 30+ miles to one of the hospitals in Salt Lake City. In 1904, with money contributed from miners' paychecks and the backing of the Western Federation of Miners Union, the Park City Miners Hospital was founded. Besides miners, the hospital also treated deserving widows, expectant mothers, the Chinese population, and other locals who enjoyed quiet rooms, seasonal vegetables from the hospital's garden, and the knowledgeable nursing staff. But in 1919, financial difficulties, caused mostly by labor disputes, forced the hospital to close. An article in the Park Record, May 1925, stated, "The hospital became the football of the miners' union and was kicked about by its different factions until the morale of the entire institution began to deteriorate." We were now back to the primitive conditions of 1900 without hospital facilities of any kind. Margaret Alice had worked for the hospital, and in 1920, with the cooperation of the mining companies, she opened an emergency clinic in rented rooms in the new hotel. She also added a maternity hospital in her home the same year. In 1922, she bought a controlling interest in the miners' hospital. She negotiated the cooperation of the mining companies in rehabilitating the building, which had stood empty since 1919. And the doors reopened on September 13th, 1922, with Margaret Alice as manager. In 1936, the Park Record wrote, "Mrs. Clark is to be complimented and thanked for her aggressive spirit and thoughts for the comfort of her charges." She retired in 1939 and moved to California. She died in Inglewood, California in 1969. Next, we have Sarah Elvira Pace, or Elle, as she was known. She was born in 1860 in Bountiful, the oldest child of Sarah Elvira Stanley and George Milton Pace. The family had moved to Parley's Park soon after it was established by Parley P. Pratt. Beginning with cattle given to them by Sarah's grandmother, they raised beef and dairy cattle, an operation that eventually became, this will sound familiar to those of you in the farming world, the Deseret Livestock Company. One of the Pace's neighbors and a partner in Deseret Livestock was Amos Atkinson. His wife, Alice Prescott Atkinson, received frequent visits from her brother James. After James met Elle, his visits became even more frequent and then progressed to courtship. Elle and James would go dancing and to parties in Wanship, about 7 miles down the canyon, sometimes taking Elle's younger siblings with them. In 1880, James and Elle married. The couple first lived near their families in Silver Creek, but as development began on mines in the Park City area, waste from these dumped into streams running through the ranch. This poisoned the water and killed a number of livestock. Sadly, Elle's first 3 babies, born between 1878 and 1881, also died. All were born while they lived in Silver Creek. In 1890, James's brother-in-law, Amos Atkinson, became discouraged with the poisoned land and moved to Camas Valley. James and Elle followed him in 1896. They settled in Francis, where James raised cattle and acted as veterinarian for the valley. Elle served as president of the Francis Relief Society for over 20 years. She also became well known for her natural nursing skills. She had no formal training, but learned nursing from her mother and mother-in-law. James stepped in to help with the children and household chores so Elle could share her healing gifts. It is estimated that Elle helped birth more than 300 babies in the Camas Valley. Besides all these babies for her neighbors, Elle raised children of her own. Her first 3 babies died as infants, and her 7th child died from pneumonia at age 4, but Elle's other 7 children all grew to adulthood. Additionally, at age 60, Elle took on the care of 5 of her grandchildren after her daughter-in-law, Hazel May Leffler, died from the Spanish flu in 1920. James died in 1926, and Elle moved into the home of her widowed son, Lauren. In 1937, at the age of 77, Elle suffered a stroke while nursing her granddaughter. This effectively ended her years of nursing, and she died in 1942. She and James are buried in Bountiful. Rosalind Rose Fitzgerald was born in Woodland in 1921, the youngest daughter and 5th of 6 children of Emma May Webb and Isaac May Fitzgerald. Emma May was a nurse who had worked with Dr. Dannenberg through the Spanish flu epidemic. At that time, the Park Record wrote, "Due to Dr. Dannenberg's wonderful work, the influenza epidemic has been entirely stamped out in the districts of Bench Creek, Woodland, Francis, Camas, and Marion. We sincerely wish that all towns had as capable a doctor as the town of Camas." Isaac was a rancher breeding horses and cattle, and Rose enjoyed her life on the family farm. But perhaps inspired by her mother, Rose's first love was nursing. After graduating from South Summit High School, Rose went on to train as a registered nurse at St. Mary's of the Wasatch College and Holy Cross Hospital in Salt Lake City as part of the Nurse Cadet program. She enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps, rising to the rank of lieutenant. The last 6 months of her training were at Bushnell General Army Hospital in Brigham City. Bushnell General specialized in, amongst other things, maxillofacial surgery, and there she met First Lieutenant Harry John Bigelow, an Army tank commander from Iowa who had been injured while on active duty and was at Bushnell General for surgery on his eye and arm. They married in 1947 and made their home in Camas, where they raised 4 children. Rose continued her nursing career, serving in the Summit County Hospital in Camas and as practice nurse to Dr. Kumagai. In 1965, she became the Summit County Public Health Nurse for both Camas and Park City. Her son Ron remembers, "Mom was very proud of her nursing ability, and she used it in many different capacities." Her son Jim says, "I remember being at the table as a family when the phone would ring or someone would come to the door, and she would have to go give a shot, look at a cut, or help the doctor with an emergency. And if it was serious enough, Dad would hop in the family station wagon and run them to the hospital." And Ron adds, "Rarely was she not nursing, and often, on top of that, she assisted Dad with the ambulance." John also served as volunteer ambulance driver, despite being blind in one eye. In 1950, John and Rose's brothers, Rem, Ken, and Ron Fitzgerald, built the Chanis Cafe. John was cook and manager. Ron says, "When Dad became the janitor of the elementary school, Mom would manage the cafe while he was janitoring. She had to be very organized to do all that she did and to take care of all her responsibilities. Her house was always an orderly place, and so was the cafe. Her daughter-in-law, Sharon Bigelow, wrote, "Rose was a working mother who managed a household and a job in a day when women pretty much did it alone." John died in 1991 and Rose in 2009. They are buried in Woodlands. And with that, I will turn over to Pat.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Hope I can see this. I didn't know I was going to be reading in the dark. My mom, Helen Louise Harriet Besant, was a strong woman. And I do get to talk about my mom. So, anyway, my mom, Helen Louise Harriet, was born in 1919 in Wellsville, Utah, to Ernie and Alma Harriet. Her father was a pharmacist, and since jobs for pharmacists were few in the early 20th century, work took them to various places throughout northern Utah and Idaho. My daughter could come up and hold the flashlight. You sure?
I think easily, yeah.
I've got it.
Your grandson.
Fantastic. Thank
My
you.
grandson will hold. Oh, he's got one.
Perfect.
Great. I need all the support I can get. And if Paul turns to the next slide too fast, it's not his fault, it's mine, because I'm going to add stuff on that he doesn't know about. Okay. The family eventually settled in Pleasant Grove, where Ern bought the Shady Inn. You want to have dinner at the Shady Inn? A restaurant in Pleasant Grove in 1935. He continued to work as a pharmacist at the Thornton Drug Company, and Mom worked at the inn between her high school studies. It is here where she met Pete, Leo Besant. Mom had decided as a child that she wanted to become a nurse, and after graduating from Pleasant Grove High School in 1937, she enrolled in the nursing program at Salt Lake County General Hospital. It was a 3-year program. Attending nursing school during the late 30s required great determination. In exchange for $7 per month and room and board, student nurses were required to work 6 to 8 hours each weekday, as well as every other weekend. This was in addition to attending school and completing their homework. Curfew was at 9 p.m. and they had 1 weekend off each month. Helen chose to spend these with Pete as their relationship continued to flourish. Based on an interview that she had with the University of Utah, here's a list of things that she endured in nursing school. These are some of the rules. Stand up when a physician enters the room. Do not talk to physicians or orderlies. Do not marry while in training. Curfew. Passes for weekends had to be arranged ahead of time. Pay was, this one says $12 per month, with $5 taken out each month to pay for capes. So she had to pay $7 to go to school a month, but they paid her $12, but then they took $5 of it back to have a cape for graduation. And the student nurses were known as probies. They were on probation for the first 6 weeks. While she was in nursing school in her junior year, a tragic accident occurred that required all the nursing staff as well as the senior nursing students to leave the hospital and assist in the treatment of the victims at the scene of the accident. The Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad's train number 31, the Flying Ute, was running late on its journey from Helper. At the same time, a Jordan High School bus approached Bergen's Crossing. The resulting collision was America's worst school bus accident to date. As the nursing supervisor left the floor, she shouted, "Helen, you're in charge." Fortunately, there were no emergencies, and Helen, assisted by 3 other student nurses, was able to maintain the medical floor until the nursing staff returned with the survivors of the accident. I read somewhere that all buses have to stop at railroad crossings, even if the light is not on now, and they are supposed to open the door and they're supposed to listen and look. And that has been changed all over America because of that accident. And I also read that there were 25 students and the driver who died, and 14 survived, and many of them with very bad injuries. After graduation from nursing school, after 3 years, Mom took a job at Utah Valley Hospital in Provo, Utah, which paid $50 a month and also provided room, board, and laundry. She worked here until she married Pete on September 26, 1940, after which she took a few months off to enjoy the companionship of her new husband. At the end of 1940, Helen took a new nursing job at American Fork Hospital, which meant a raise to $80 a month. She worked here until the birth of their firstborn. That's me, Patricia, in 1942, November of 1942. A month later, in December 1942, Pete was drafted into the Army and was sent to Florida for basic training and then to Boston for training on aircraft maintenance. Mom and I moved to Camas, where her father was working for Doug Simpson as the pharmacist, and where she took up the post as public health nurse for Summit County. She also assisted in many home deliveries, as well as performing one by herself when the doctor did not arrive in time. She also worked for Dr. Wright as his practice nurse, and also Dr. Bingham. While he was in Boston, my dad was badly injured. His shirt caught fire while cleaning plane parts. His right arm and right side of his chest were burned. This accident was caused by another soldier who was careless, came in from being outside smoking, and he threw his cigarette in a barrel he thought was trash, but it was gasoline that flared up, and my dad was badly burned. Helen, however, Mom, she couldn't even go visit him. The Army said she couldn't, but when he was transferred to Mountain Home, Idaho, she took me and we went up there and visited before he was sent to England. After his discharge in 1945, Daddy joined Helen in Camas and worked with Ernie at Simpson Drug. He did a variety of jobs, including grinding beef for burger, making ice cream, and selling and installing home appliances that were the new thing in the post-war period. He also worked on the building of the theater for Doug. Helen took a new job. Oh, I've already told you that. Sorry. Soon after that, in 1949, their second child was born, my sister Shauna. In 1951, my grandfather, Mom's dad, died, leaving Camas and Simpson Drug without a pharmacist. Doug Simpson was allowed to fill prescriptions for a while, but as he wrote, it was quite a strain on me because I knew that if I made a mistake, the state would have my head in a noose. I thought maybe the time had come to get out of the store business. So soon after that, Helen and Pete and the newly hired pharmacist Keith Story purchased the drugstore. A couple years later, Keith Story left the partnership, and from then on, Mom and Dad had to find pharmacists to work for them. It was hard to find pharmacists who wanted to move to Camas. Probably wouldn't be so hard now. People want to move to Camas. In 1958, while my dad was away for the night, the first time in quite a while, and right after they had just finished remodeling the drugstore, Mom was awakened in the middle of the night by the town fire whistle. Who remembers the fire whistle? The store was on fire. The park record reported intense heat created bizarre effects within the store. Almost everything plastic was melted. Much of the goods were so discolored by smoke and heat that they would be a total loss. They thought it was started by an electrical short of some kind. All appeared lost, but the community loved the store and the people who ran it. They rallied round to help. Pete and Helen were able to reopen the store in 2 months. They continued to run the store until 1968. After a heart attack in 1966, my dad had to slow down, and so they sold the store in 1968. I think I missed something.
Really good.
Well, in 1977, my dad died, and Mom didn't work until the following year. He died in November on my birthday. Eventually, she took a job as a nurse at Shriners Hospital in Salt Lake City. She sold her house in Camas in 1979 and moved closer to work. In 1981, she moved to a job as a pediatric nurse at Cottonwood Hospital and then at the Salt Lake County Health Department until she retired permanently in 1990. She died in 2017 and is buried with Pete in Marion. I have to say, I don't need that anymore.
Okay.
I have to say my mom was a strong woman, and I know how many times people have come up to me and told me stories about my mom, helping them with their babies after they were born, helping them with other things. I have a distinct memory of sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner, and the phone rang. Phone's right there by the table, right there in the kitchen. You know how those old phones were. And someone had a problem. Their turkey didn't smell good. They'd taken it out of the oven, and one of the kids said, I don't know if it's safe to eat. And so they called Mom, and the woman had said they had stuffed it the night before with warm stuffing and put it in the turkey and left it out to sit out all night. And Mom advised them, don't eat it. And that's a memory. But then I've just over and over, I've heard that. And my mom taught me to be compassionate to people, especially people who were sick. There was a neighbor a few blocks away from us who walked by our house every day, and he had epilepsy. And in those days, I didn't know what that was, but she explained it to me, and she explained why most of the people in town didn't want anything to do with this man. And she told me, you don't do that. You be compassionate. Mom was a strong person living here in Camas for at least 15 years, and she was not LDS. And it was too far to drive to Salt Lake or Provo to go to church for her at that time, until there was a little church here in Camas that she went to. But she loved the people of Camas, and she almost beat that into me, to love these people, love all these people. And she talked about, those are good people. Yes, they're poor, or yes, they whatever. She taught me to love. She was a strong woman.
So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you all for sticking it out. We try and keep these under an hour, but when you're working with a group of mostly strong women, it's hard to limit the number of strong women you can talk about. But just a couple of things. Wrong button. Our next presentation is going to be on the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. And it will be on Camas Valley Civic Leaders. And it will be at 2 o'clock here again. We also have our calendars over here on the side for $10. If you haven't picked one up yet, they're getting cheaper. You only get 9 months of the year to use it. So, and finally, our museum is outside, and we would love for you to stop in and check it out. And again, thank you to our presenters and to all of you for coming today.
So